Good evening. My name is Leah Constantine and I am the Sydney Office Managing Partner for Ashurst, the law firm that you're all sitting in our beautiful ballroom. It's an absolute privilege to have so many of you here and to, of course, to have the US Study Centre have this terrific function here at our office. We're very pleased that you're here. Before we begin, I acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As I said, a very warm welcome to all. For those of you who are not aware, Ashurst is a global law firm. We have quite a significant presence, 27 offices around the globe, and it's our privilege to host the US Study Centre CEO to CEO series this evening, particularly these CEOs on this topic, very topical thing to discuss at the moment. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Simon Jackman, the United States Study Centre CEO, who will commence this evening's formal proceedings. So again, from me, thank you very much for coming and all the best for a great evening.
Thank you, Leah, and thanks to everybody here at Ashurst. It's an amazing space, and the United States Study Centre is often the beneficiary of very generous supporters here in the CBD, providing their fantastic space to us, and tonight is way up on the list of fantastic spaces that we've had the great privilege of being able to use for events like this. Also want to thank my staff from the US Study Centre for helping stage another well-attended event, one of many that we've done this year. The mission of the United States Study Centre is to deepen Australians' understanding of the United States and of Australia's relationship with the United States in a number of principal domains: foreign policy, defence and strategy, in economics and business, in society, politics and culture. The defence relationship often fills the frame when we talk about the relationship between Australia and the United States, and to be sure, that is a vital area of research and advocacy for the Centre. But few Australians sufficiently understand the scope of the economic relationship between Australia and the United States. The government stuff and foreign policy and defence, very heavyweight stuff, often very slow-moving stuff, that is incredibly important to be sure, but as I often like to say, the Australia-US relationship is being transacted literally hour by hour by hundreds of people within a few hundred metres of where we're sitting right now. And it's that part of the relationship that I've been determined that the United States Study Centre has a huge focus on. That it's just too big a part of the relationship, a too important part of the relationship for a centre like ours not to be focused on. And so to that end, a couple of months ago, we released a lengthy, detailed look at the investment relationship between the two countries. One of the things I wasn't aware of is that the two-way cumulative investment flow between Australia and the United States is valued at $1.45 trillion Australian. That's a staggering sum, over 800 million invested from the United States into Australia, making the United States the single largest source of foreign investment in Australia, and over 600 billion of Australian dollars, your superannuation at work, seeking yield diversification in the United States. The United States, the single largest destination for Australian investment dollars on the outbound. With support from the New South Wales government, we've been examining another part of the business relationship between Australia and the United States, and that is with respect to innovation and entrepreneurship. We've been seeking to draw lessons from various case studies in the United States, state and local governments, clearly of interest to the state government, the New South Wales government that's asked us to undertake this work. Identifying areas of opportunity for Australian businesses, for Australian policymakers, and indeed pitfalls to avoid. And then another component of that is what we're doing tonight, this speaker series that we've stood up. This is the second time we've done a CEO to CEO event. These are, I think, best described as an occasional series for the centre. We're averaging about once a quarter. We'd probably like to up that tempo if we could. Where we engage in dialogues with leaders of businesses, typically US-owned businesses, that are doing innovative work here in Australia. and whose, as I said earlier, whose businesses are very much part of the living connective tissue binding Australia and the United States. And tonight I'm so pleased to have the Australian leaders of two of those businesses, Airbnb and Uber. Extremely interesting businesses that have transformed their respective markets, as you all know, founded in the United States, adopted with great enthusiasm, but perhaps with a little controversy by Australians. To my right is Sam McDonagh, Airbnb's Country Manager for Australia and New Zealand. He's got over 25 years of management experience in Australia, the United States, Asia, at a really interesting array of companies that range from eBay, where he was there for 10 years, part of the startup management team in Australia, becoming finance director and new ventures manager in the United States, and then finally directing Southeast Asian operations. iiNet, not a US-owned business, an Australian-owned business, and then sort of a little out of the box, Dollar Shave Club. One of my sort of more fun businesses to keep an eye on. If you know who the American comedian Norm Macdonald is, you'll love those ads about Dollar Shave Club. And then, of course, the role as country manager, Australia and New Zealand manager for Airbnb. To my left, David Rohrsheim. David is Uber's general manager for Australia and New Zealand. That has over 200 staff in the region. I guess you don't count drivers as staff, no. That would be a much bigger number than 200 if we were to include that. We might get into that later. In 2012, David brought Uber's technology to Sydney as a founding member of the Australian team here, and since then he's grown the uptake of Uber, both on the driver side and on the rider side across Australia and New Zealand. But before that, he too has spent time in the United States, up the road from eBay, not far off the Stanford campus, a veteran of Sand Hill Row, DJF, one of the Valley's bigger venture capital funds, where he helped scale more than 40 tech startups. Quite an interesting story there that we'll get into a little bit later on. So the running order will be that I'll do a little bit of Q&A seriatim, and then we'll open it up. And my experience with these sorts of events, with an audience as large as the one we've got, with guys as interesting as this running businesses as interesting as the ones they do, the questions from the floor, I think will be the real interesting part of tonight. So I'll try to keep my part of proceedings short and sweet if we can. So I'll start with Sam. And I just want to go back to that list of companies. eBay, iiNet, Dollar Shave Club, and Airbnb. It's like there isn't a single sort of sector commonality there. It's more like disruption and innovation as professional calling. I wonder how you describe kind of what's driven you through those four different businesses. If I had to find a thread in common there, it'd be the way they're, happily phrased, disrupting their particular sectors.
Yeah, there's probably a few people I've worked with over time that would say I'm a bit disruptive, but maybe one of my school teachers from primary school would say the same thing. Yeah, look, I think that is a thread. I think it's there's probably a couple of things. One as a marketplace, and one certainly eBay was a marketplace and certainly disruptive. And the other is probably certainly disruptive. But I think it's one of the things that I think that does highlight each of those businesses, and certainly the bigger ones, is that they've all played a part in making something bigger and a new way of doing things. And I think that's probably been a prerequisite, I think, for me. And I would certainly say that I'm certainly not an inventor. And I think all of these businesses have been invented by someone, but it's always been good to be an innovator within those businesses and help them grow from early stage to sort of billion-dollar businesses. And I think that's probably a thing that is a characteristic of each of those.
Sure. The other characteristic, though, and I identified that earlier, 3 out of 4 are US-based, US-owned, US-founded. And you also mentioned the culture of innovation inside each of them. I'm wondering, I spent 20 years of my life in Northern California. eBay is based down there, close to San Jose. Australians, I think we understand what's different about that place, but I'm wondering, given your own career arc, how would you describe that culture of innovation, that's peculiar to that part of the world? How would you sort of translate that for Australian ears?
Gosh, I think I was fortunate enough, I think, to go and spend a couple of years working in New York, and I think in sort of 96, 97, when the internet was really sort of coming on stream, and I'd worked on a couple of projects that included an ISP for universities in the northeast of the United States. Whilst there was Silicon Valley in California, there was Silicon Alley in New York, and there was a lot of technology and design firms that were starting to explore with the internet and the way of doing things. And I think I was actually fortunate from a finance background to be given the opportunity to work at eBay, sort of here in Australia as a startup team. And one of the things that really came about with PPL acquiring the joint venture rights to MSN here in Australia and others, and eBay was one of those. And so that was interesting to be able to turn a finance opportunity into a business opportunity and marketing and general management sort of on the back of that. And I think one of the things that I think that was available early on was what's working overseas and how does that work in Australia. And I think a lot of the early innovation in Australia came from, this is what's happening in the US or in somewhere like Silicon Valley where there's a lot of innovation taking place, so how can we replicate that in Australia? And I think some of the early growth that certainly eBay saw was part of that, but also part of being able to jump on the network effects that a global marketplace sort of had, and I think that's certainly something that is true also at Airbnb. But I think the innovation, I think, is something that follows and is certainly prevalent here in Australia, where I'll let David sort of talk to where Uber might be sort of in Australia relative to other markets globally. But I think eBay was the most penetrated market for eBay globally in terms of as a percentage of use or a percentage of users. I think you've seen things similarly from a PayPal point of view. I think the same could be said as for Facebook, and we would certainly say the same thing at Airbnb. We're the most penetrated market as a percentage of users of a population, or at least say an addressable population of any market in the world. And I think the opportunity that we have in Australia from an innovation point of view going forward is, so how do we show up in the mass market? And I think that's a challenge that we certainly have, and I think it's a challenge that other tech companies have as well, because Australians as early adopters of technology they'll get there, and then all of a sudden we're out in front. And so what do we do when we're there? And we can be a location for those brands and those businesses to go back to headquarters or other parts of the world and say, well, here's how it works here. How do we look like?
That's really interesting on a number of fronts. Those penetration rates in Australia for both eBay and for Airbnb, I have no idea about that. That's really staggering. But it sort of does beg the question, Australians do have this reputation of being early adopters of tech. If we're that into it, if you will, on the consumer side, why aren't we more into it on the entrepreneur side, on the supply side?
Well, I think we're into it from an entrepreneurial sort of perspective, and that's where we want to be. And I think that highlights how we get there sort of so quickly. I think it does come down to the invention piece, and I think how we're encouraged to are we encouraged to lead and make mistakes? I'm not sure in Australia where making mistakes is that accepted, and so I think it's like, once something works, let's grab hold of it and make it the best in the world. But are we inventing? And of course, we've got examples where we have done that, and we have invented things. But I think our strong suit would be taking something that's working and then making it our own and making it the best it can be.
Okay. I want to talk about Airbnb for a moment. It and Uber, the thing they've got in common, many things they've got in common. One thing they've got in common is this use of technology to, if not blow up a market, then certainly to expand the market, who suppliers are into a given market, who are consumers in a given market. Both have been characterised by incredible growth, international reach, these network effects that you were talking about. I think that's true for eBay, it's true for Airbnb, it's true for Uber. But at what point, and later on I might ask David a similar question, but at what point does Airbnb become the incumbent and start to become vulnerable itself? And, you know, if I were to be thinking out loud, I'd be imagining a Chinese facing version of the app that was selling Australian short stays in Mandarin, and with a sort of in a way that was sort of more friendly perhaps, or positioned itself as being more friendly to a non-English speaking market, say. And so I'm just wondering how you guys are thinking at the same time when you're undergoing this incredible rapid growth, but at what point does you have to start taking a look over your shoulder?
Yeah, look, I think we certainly need to stay attuned to that, and Airbnb will be 10 years old as a company next year. I think we're really, and I think in our first sort of 4 years, we only had 1 million users, and that was a really tough time. In the next sort of 2 years, we grew from 1 million to 20 million, and then in the last 4 years, we've grown from sort of 20 million to 200 million. So I do think that there is an opportunity there. You know, we need to be really conscious of being disrupted. I've addressed the China thing just for a moment. I think we're looking at China differently than maybe other companies have looked at China, and I think we're certainly on the record. We launched iBuying, which is our Chinese brand. It's the only part of the world where we've got a different brand and a different app that works differently, because you've got to address that market to the customer, and you've got to be completely relevant. We know that the benefit that we have is that with the Chinese outbound travelling population, we'll be looking for places to stay. We've got 4 million of those spaces for them to stay all around the world now, and so we think that that's really a really strong advantage for us. But we also need to be relevant domestically in China, and I think by building behind the wall and partnering with the right folks in China, we're hoping to maybe reverse the trend of Western technology companies in China. But I think maybe bringing that more back here, where were we going on the other part of it, apart from China?
Well, I wasn't going. That was just sort of exhibit A. But,
okay.
but just if I had to, you know, I don't know your business, but from the outside, I'd be thinking
the general disruption.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things for Airbnb is that Brian Chesky, our CEO, is a fairly prolific reader, and he's a big fan of Walt Disney. And Walt Disney's biography, The Triumph of the American Imagination, is something that Brian uses in business sort of quite a lot. So we had a Pixar artist come in and basically map the Airbnb customer experience, or we call it the customer journey. And there were 31 frames. Now, of those 31 frames of the customer journey, only 2 of those take place in the home. And so at that point, when we realised, you know, gee, we've got this business that's based on 2/31 of what our customers are doing, we better start thinking about other things. And so one of those things is experiences. And so how do we ensure that when an Airbnb guest is in a city and wants to live like a local, what are the local experiences that they're able to undertake? And so that was our first segue down as sort of a different path, so that we're not necessarily disrupted. But at the moment, I would also say that Airbnb is all things to all people, and this is a challenge that eBay had probably back in 2004. It was a marketplace, and everything was all in one place. And so I think we've got to start thinking about categorisation and making it easier for the customer to find the kind of place that they want to stay and have that live like a local sort of experience. And the same way that Airbnb started catering for under supply of accommodation during events, I think there's an opportunity for event-based apps to, well, we can just do this event, and how will that work? And Airbnb needs to continue to be relevant beyond that. So I think the same way that eBay was disrupted by individual category providers such as Zappos, it was easier to buy shoes on Zappos than it was to buy shoes on eBay. Airbnb needs to continue to be relevant in terms of the best place and the easiest place to book accommodation all around the world.
Okay. One thing I did want to ask about, both of you, regulation in the markets in which you're going into, both play a key role in sort of defining the market and the opportunity to go into it and bring a different product to bear in that market. You've done that twice now, bringing businesses, eBay and Airbnb into Australia. How would you characterise, I mean, let's talk about the Airbnb experience, I suppose, the most relevant, but the regulatory environment and perhaps across Australia, different Australian jurisdictions, enabling, inhibiting, neutral, relative to, say, the way Airbnb has gone into other jurisdictions around the world?
Yeah, sure. So the one, at Airbnb, we actually believe that regulation is a good thing, provided that it's fair and progressive. And the thing that regulation does is provide certainty for our hosts and guests, and again, we think that's a good thing. And so we're committed to working with government at all levels, whether it be federal, state or local, to ensure that there is sort of good regulation and the certainty that I refer to. In Australia, we actually have obviously with our 6 states and 2 territories, different regulations that exist. The laws for short-term rentals and accommodation are set at a state level, and then they're enforced locally. And with I guess the 6 states, 2 territories, and I think 570 local governments around Australia, it's a bit of a challenge. Like, you could live on one side of the street and have different regulations than the person that lives on the other side of the street. And then you might be in the same council, but you speak to a different ranger and they have a different perception of what a bed and breakfast is. And sometimes, of course, that's not what Airbnb is necessarily all about. But here in Australia, we do have some of the best examples of the world of progressive and fair regulations, and South Australia has led the way in that, in as much as how they've regulated like sort of home sharing and the legislation around short-term rentals and the guidance they've provided. They've been followed by Tasmania, who again have recognised the benefit that short-term rentals and accommodation has sort of brought to the Tasmanian sort of tourism economy. New South Wales is going through a process at the moment. They held arguably the most thorough inquiry into short-term rentals anywhere in the world, an 18-month-long inquiry that Mark Curate led. Unfortunately, that's gone back and come back out as an options paper, which at Parliament House this evening they're considering and talking about. So hopefully there'll be some outcome in relation to New South Wales sometime soon. But again, we think it's a good thing, and we'll continue to work with government. And ultimately, I think a tidal wave has no bias, and so I think ultimately the consumers will get it right.
I like that metaphor. That's great. One thing, last question, is I just wanted to ask you about Airbnb has taken a stand on same-sex marriage. They've come out on very strongly for the yes case. Just wondering if you could say a few words on how that fits in to the company's sense of itself and what you're trying to accomplish with that advocacy for the yes case.
Certainly. So in 2014, Airbnb rebranded itself from the white and blue in the cloud, where we came out with the Balo and our vision. And we were very clear in our vision being, we believe in a world where people can belong anywhere. And so marriage equality is certainly something that is very close to the Airbnb DNA. It's, in a world where people, where we believe where people can belong anywhere, we believe that people should have the opportunity to marry the person they love. And that's really at the core of what we do. And whether it be our sort of stand on refugees or anything else that's sort of happening around the world, I think that's really important. And we'll continue to certainly support the Yes campaign sort of here in Australia, and hopefully we'll see that sort of get up and I think be a really important step, not just for those folks and those friends and brothers, sisters of ours that want to have that opportunity, but also I think it's important for how Australia is positioned in the global landscape.
Thanks so much. David, wondering if we could just start talking about, before Uber, the Sand Hill Road time, and what it's like being an Australian in that environment, for one thing, and if you had any takeaways from your sense of the VC industry there versus what you're seeing back here, if you've got time to be keeping an eye on that at all when you're not wearing your Uber hat.
Yeah, not too much, to be honest. So yes, I spent a few years working in venture in San Francisco, and in hindsight, I realised how lucky it was for an Australian to get, for anybody to get that job, and for an Australian in particular. But I think it was kind of the DFJ way. They just like the outliers, and so the Australian that showed up was their candidate. I was there in my first week. We flew first class to Luxembourg for a board meeting. It was amazing. It was the coolest thing ever. And it was around 2008, and something was going on in the East Coast USA, which seemed to be a bit of a problem. It turned into a big problem. Suddenly we're in the GFC, and so we really didn't make a whole lot of new investments. We were focused on the companies that we had, and probably learned more through that. You really understand what were the terms that you signed up to when the money's running out and you're trying to decide which companies to keep. So that was the experience I got out of that, and frankly learned that the odds of success are pretty low. And having seen it up close and personal, so that certainly informed my choices going forward. Joining Uber was someone else's idea. It had already been invented. I got a salary, so that was a sort of safer risk return for me.
Can I ask what spurred the decision to come back to Australia?
It was always going to happen. So I went to the US. Hometown was Adelaide, but an IT geek. So when one way or another an opportunity came up to work in Silicon Valley, I had to go do it. Out of curiosity, went to Facebook, poked one of the servers just for the novelty of it, but always knew home was home, and so kept my eyes out for a good excuse to come back. It came sooner than I thought, because I was really enjoying myself there. I was in a relationship, everything was going. Had lots of friends after business school, but the Uber thing got me, having gone through the interview process, which is quite a simulation of doing the job. I became quite, I guess, concerned that it might work, and I knew that if I didn't do it and someone else did, and then I was reading about it in the paper, that would be sort of an inconsolable regret. So that's why I knew I had to go do it. I was still at a time in life when I could just change my mind and go.
Excellent.
Do it.
Well done. So let me ask a question that I posed earlier, and that is just your experience with bringing, so here's a company, it's got a product that's fairly mature in some sense, has been rolled out at an enormous scale in other markets, and then you bring it to Australia. And what you were sort of reporting back to the company about the experience, perhaps on the one hand, enormous uptake, enormous consumer demand, and I imagine the penetration numbers, you might share those with us. I imagine Australia rates pretty highly. But perhaps also on the regulatory side, and without getting into the details there that are ongoing, and maybe someone else in the audience might ask you that question later, but give us a sense of, relative to Uber's experience around the world, how coming into Australian jurisdictions sort of compares.
Yeah, we can start to look back now over 5 years and do a bit of a compare and contrast. So Australia was actually quite early on Uber's schedule. London and Paris, and then Sydney and Melbourne were the first 4 international cities. And that was partly driven because somebody showed up that was keen to go do it, but remember the product in 2012 was a luxury option, Uber Black exclusively. And that was a more expensive option to a taxi, so that was never a hugely disruptive vision. That was a niche product. And Sydney and Melbourne were cities where we were confident that there was a bunch of people that wanted to look rich, driving around in a nice-looking limo, and so that's why they were high on the list. As far as the regulations go, it's hard to summarise global affairs in a couple of minutes, but Australia is actually now looking like we are a very impatient group. I can apologise for that in hindsight, but it now looks like Australia has been one of the faster jurisdictions, and some of the regulations that are in Australia are, we have regulators from other countries come and visit and meet with, say, New South Wales in particular, and say, hey, how did you do it? Particularly, what was the grand bargain whereby everybody walked away from this, still with the business and the sky hasn't fallen in, so that, which has been the experience in Australia. So, yeah, pretty good. And it's a state-based matter for me, and so I would argue that the states that do get on with regulating, which is what the entrepreneurs want, because it does give you that certainty, the states that have got getting a reputation for doing that faster will attract more entrepreneurs, because they know that if you come to this New South Wales generally been pretty good. You'll get a fair hearing, and the states that are a bit slower probably won't have so many entrepreneurs showing up with crazy ideas.
Apart from the idiosyncratic factor of your own desire to come back to Australia, is there something about Sydney, Melbourne, Australia more generally that's attractive as a relatively early market for American tech companies? And my sense is I'm asking a leading question. I think the answer is yes, and I could list off a couple of factors as to why I think that's the case, but I'd be interested in your take on that.
Seems to be yes. There is clearly a lot of cultural influence. Visiting the same websites and watching the same TV shows. Language is obviously an easy one. GST is not an easy one. That's one that really confused the engineers when they had to deal with that.
Multiply by 1.1.
And tolls. Tolls were hard. It was the first city in the world that had underground tolling points, and when you got no GPS signal, that was something we had to figure out. And look, it's the demographics are good, particularly remembering it was a luxury product. There are a certain good number of Australians that want to trade money for time, and that's what we came offering.
Sure.
And a lot of technology is in that space, and that's why I think there's plenty of Australians that will buy the latest iPhone because they can afford it. It's a bit of a luxury, but there's people that want that.
One thing I do want to ask you about, and this I've got through friends back in California, I know a little bit about this, the role that analytics plays, data analytics plays at Uber. You guys operating at such scale, such vast amounts of data coming in minute by minute. Can you say a little bit about how that informs the business here, where I imagine most of the work there is being done back at the mothership in the United States, but how that filters the insights driven out of that filters its way into the product that Australians will be experiencing in the app here? Without giving too much away.
I looked this up the other day. When I joined Uber, I had a few weeks of training in San Francisco to get the hang of things, and then had this long flight back to Sydney, and they said, I wanted to do some analytics, like see how many Australians had signed up. 209 was the answer. But one of the data scientists just said, yeah, here's a copy of the database. And just put it on my laptop, the whole thing.
Wow.
So it fit on a laptop 5 years ago. It has since exploded, and the biggest data point is all of the GPS signals tracking the driver from A to B, so that's an enormous amount of data, so it doesn't fit on a laptop anymore. Some of the main places it's going into with the pricing, the real-time pricing, figuring out when do the prices need to go up to get drivers into that area. That's a real-time algorithm. There's a far bigger piece of work going on in the autonomous world, like that whole machine is just looking at the world, trying to figure out is that a tree or not tree, and then what to do next. So we're trying to get some of the world's best data scientists onto that. Locally, lots of visualization, so we can see in real time, wow, something's going on at the SCG, game just finished. Team can see that in real time, send text messages to drivers nearby.
So somewhere there's a very cool control room with awesome monitors and all sorts of visualizations of what we're up to as a country and where drivers and riders need drivers. Well, one day we'll have to see that. That sounds really awesome. The other thing, the flip side of analytics is experimentation. I know at eBay that has become part of the data science team there, probably post your time, I don't know, has embraced that. I know at Amazon, I know at Google, those data science teams, the product is constantly being tweaked in various ways. I'm wondering if that's part of the ethos at Uber. It may not be visible to any single user of the app or any single driver that they're actually part of a controlled experiment testing out new features. But I imagine that's going on all the time.
Yeah, absolutely true. True for a lot of websites. Two people standing next to each other might see something different. You're always part of an experiment. For us, the marketing is where we've had the most fun. To launch globally, rapidly, we set up folks like me in cities all around the world, and they were tasked with, look, here's the software, here's the app, go figure out how to make it happen in Sydney, in your town. And so there was quite a lot of freedom back in the day. when we found that one general manager's idea became front page news in the New York Times,
Don't do that.
We've had to realise maybe we should have some boundaries. But something like Uber Kittens was just an idea from the Seattle team on National Cat Day in the United States, and the internet loves cats, so that exploded. And next year, 20 cities copied it. Sydney, proud to say, was first in the world to do Uber boats, which has been replicated in places like Boston and Stockholm, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been encouraged, is pushing out responsibility as far as they can, which makes my job fun, and then everybody copying aggressively when something good happens.
And I'm just, this will be my last question before we open it up, but we spoke the other day on the phone, and I was curious about how it goes managing a business here that's 5 to 7 hours time shifted away from head office, as it were, and some of the challenges that presents. And you brought up in response saying, well, actually, it's been interesting since the election of Trump that a small amount of engineering talent has thought about plonking itself outside the United States. I'm wondering if you could sort of repeat that for everybody and give us your sense of what's driving that, and perhaps even a realistic assessment of the scale of that.
Hard to quantify, but we have relocated a bunch of Australians over to California for engineering purposes, and there was a phase. It was more true 6 months ago when the immigration bans were invented, and there was a whole lot of just concern or confusion about what that meant. And there was some number of Australians that were like, look, I think I will get a visa, and you're telling me this is going to be fine, but do I want to deal with this at the border, this uncertainty? So there's a decent number of people who said, I'm not so interested, in a way that they might have said yes a year or two beforehand. So that's an opportunity for everybody else, and there's a couple of nations that are really going after that. I think New Zealand in particular, because it's even fewer hours time difference to California. It has been, it is enough time zones to be annoying though. We have one global staff meeting every week. It's 10 a.m. in San Francisco, which means 3 or 4 a.m. the next day for me. For my first 2 years, I have to do that phone call every week and present. And we always said, like, hey, can we switch the time zones up? And they said, when your market is the largest in the world, we will adjust it. And we got close when we had a China operation.
I was going to say, that,
we got quite close.
You're almost there, yeah.
That's not anymore.
All right. Well, I promised to keep my time with you short, so we can have questions. And I think we've got microphones circulating, and I see this lady right here, please. Thanks.
Hello, thank you very much for the very interesting confessions. Sorry. I'm very curious as both Airbnb and Uber are platform companies, and as such you don't really control the end-to-end user experience. So how do you look and manage the customer experience?
I think that the customer experience is really important to us, and we're constantly making changes both on the host and the guest side. And I think that we'd like to think that we're a technology company, and one way, of course, is documenting the flow, and then we have teams that work on that to try to make the experience as good as it can be. I think that at the moment, I would say that we've got a lot of work to do. I think we're constantly working on it. We're certainly nowhere near as good as it could be, whether it be in the amount of time it takes for the app to load, and we just need to continue and refine what we have to make the experience sort of better. We've got a team that's sort of focused, and we've recently reorganised our entire business around sort of the homes business, our experiences business, maybe China, and some of the other things that we're working on to make sure that the experience that someone has sort of either within the app or within the desktop or even on mobile web, what that looks like. I think it's similar to Uber. Like we're an app, which is really which is a really interesting sort of place to be. But then other people do different things in different ways, and so lots of people might use the app to to search and research, but then they might want to go and book on their desktop. And so there's lots of different experiences, but we've got to have the customer and the host as at the heart of everything that we do. And the one thing that helps us with all of that is that, you know, are we always working towards this vision of a world where people can belong anywhere, and one of our core values is be a host, and I think we apply that to not only our community but to ourselves as employees, and within that the teams that are working on things like customer experience.
One place which is pretty strict is around minimum standards around safety, and so we have always run our own background checks, and this is normally a key part of the regulation is the government coming along and saying these are the minimum standards that every platform must adopt: vehicle inspections, insurance, etc., etc. So that's sort of a firm line. And then from there, something common to both platforms is the idea of identity in the ratings. And you rate your driver, they rate you, and everybody knows that at the end of the trip. And that's great. And again, there's a minimum standard. As a driver, it's different cultures rate sort of more or less aggressively, but each city has a minimum score the driver knows they need to maintain. Every trip is another data point, so by the end of one day you've got a pretty good picture of a driver, and that's fine. That is a kind of a stick approach, but what we found, and this would certainly be true with Airbnb, is just knowing that you're bringing your real identity to that transaction. They know your name when you get in, you know their name, means people tend to bring their best self, and that is quite a strong sort of motivator. Self-policing.
Great question. Oh, right here. Thank you.
Just a couple of questions, both of them for both CEOs. So first question is around diversity and innovation. You mentioned earlier that innovation or failure is really not very favorably looked upon in Australia. So I was wondering, being an engineer, female engineer in California has 2 startups failed under her belt. She will be easily accepted to Google or Airbnb or Uber. Whereas if you are in Australia, it will be seen upon as taking a career break for a couple of years, has nothing to do, and perhaps you failed in whatever pursuit that you have endeavoured on. So do you, both companies, work in this culture, and also how do you encourage perhaps diversity as well as innovation within your own companies, or do you do that at all? And my second question is around interruption. So disruption, really. You are disruptors already in your markets, but you are constantly faced with different disruptions in new technologies. So AI, or virtual reality, that can be a potential disruption for either company, and also driverless cars for Uber in particular. So I was wondering, how do you guys target which area do you really focus on in your business operations in terms of which disruptions are potential real disruption for you guys in the future, and where do you really focus on in the future?
Lots to think about. A lesson I learned early on in the venture business from one of the partners there was exactly that example. Someone that had failed once or twice, venture backed, and another candidate who graduated straight out of Harvard Business School. And you would very regularly see several people arrive with a similar idea because there was some new technology that spurned the idea, and then you're really trying to pick which team to back. And the perspective there was, well, this person's already learned $5 million worth of lessons on someone else's money. So that's that they would invest proudly in the person that's failed a few times. That's not a common mindset in Australia, but that's to the advantage of the companies that see it that way. I have a bit of a failure budget inside the team, particularly for marketers. There's typically like a few ideas, and they always come in the door with like, I've got this great idea, we're going to do flyering, or we're going to sponsor this, or we're going to get a celebrity to do it. Some idea that they're always really passionate about. And I know it's not going to work, but you can't say so, because that's just it's definitely not how millennials learn. They want to, they need to do it themselves. And so I have this mental budget where they're going to spend about 10 or 20,000 bucks, making a few of these common mistakes, but it'll stick. So it's you have to let that happen and be pretty honest about it. On diversity, my goal is to just work with the smartest people on hard problems, and so if you're not opening your mind to all the great minds, you won't be able to do that. So that's why it's personal for me.
Maybe I'll take the diversity piece first. I mean, diversity is certainly something that we take very seriously. At Airbnb, we have a diversity council. We have bias training that every single employee sort of needs to take and sign off on. And at a company-wide meeting that we had earlier this year, we had some leading folks sort of come and talk to the whole company about that and really just get to that point around why diversity actually is better. And I think one of the examples that came out of that was you could have a set of really sharp tools, but if you've got to build a house or build something, you need a whole lot of different tools. And that's certainly something that I think sort of plays into a lot of what we do and the diverse makeup of teams and so on. So very important for us. On the disruption side of things, look, I think we'll, sort of as I mentioned before, I think we want to continue to find different ways of doing things and explore. One thing that I think we do talk about is owning the trip. And so we talked about the 31 different frames of the customer journey, and we're only maybe covering 2 or 3 of those from a home point of view. What are the experiences? What are the other things? So I think we could see ourselves living in a world at some point where you may be picked up by maybe an Uber, maybe a driverless car that knows that you're arriving on this particular flight, or you've got off this particular bus and the host is there and the host knows that they're there to meet you, or they have a certain degree of sort of technology that will be able to unlock their house that you're staying in. And I think there's a lot to be done. Air travel is another one. We've got a great partner here in Australia in Qantas, but at the same time, air travel is ripe for disruption. It still feels the same that it did nearly 25 years ago in terms of what that process looks like. So I think there are some interesting things that sort of could take place down the path on that front as well.
We're making huge investments as well. The Uber Eats is actually kind of an inconvenient piece of disruption because sometimes it makes people stay at home and have dinner rather than getting an Uber and going out. So there's a bit of a tension there on cold winter nights.
Tension.
But autonomous vehicle is coming, and it is going to, if somebody builds it and figures out how to do it, it's going to be a pretty compelling alternative to what we've got. We recognised that a few years ago, and one approach we could have taken was to say, well, we like things the way they are. We've got a great market position. 1 in 6 Australians are using the service. We like things the way it is, and we're now, frankly, in dialogue with government and have a seat at the table discussing how regulations are written. What we could do is to say, no, this new thing should be outlawed. It's not safe. It needs to be investigated further. We need to have a very long consultation process on this. That is a tactic you've seen by other incumbents in the transport industry in the past, and we know that we couldn't adopt that mindset, having sort of challenged it in the past. So autonomous vehicles are coming. We're a loss-making company, and we're already investing a lot of money in the next disruption. And some people say that's crazy, but I'd say there's a lot of, unfortunately, Australian companies that are highly profitable that are not making the same sort of investments in what comes next. I'd say that's crazier. So yeah, we're doing it on autonomous vehicles. We're going for the flying cars as well. So who knows what sticks.
Well, in a minute. Sorry, my very diligent staff jumped the gun there. But why don't we take a question? That gentleman in the back, thank you. Sorry.
Hi. Curious about the challenges of being global brands and the way in which the media is now a global platform, and the challenges that both Uber and Airbnb have both with consumers and experiences that people have in other countries, as well as the regulatory implications. So the challenges that Uber's have in London at the moment, or Airbnb's have in Paris, how do they knock on to the perception that both customers and regulators have locally here?
A few thoughts. I alluded to this earlier. There was A turning point for me was there was a safety incident in Delhi, and it made the front page of the Adelaide Advertiser. Despite similar incidents happening in that state that weren't reported on the front page of the paper. So it felt, I was angry. Went through that feeling for quite a while, but realised, Uber is an interesting company for various reasons, and so that's something to be embraced. It's not going to stop. It's not going to go away. And on the safety piece in particular, it's like, oh, it feels like we're being held to a higher standard. Yeah, we are. And the only way through that is to be 10 times safer, 100 times safer. When you do 5 billion trips, there's going to be a couple of things that happen, and you're the one big logo. And even within the industry, like, we have many competitors, but typically they don't trade under their brand name. It's just sort of taxis in general. So we have no choice to take that and invest in being 10 or 100 times better. On the regulations, London, Australia definitely looks to the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth. We often joke about how to organise the company, and putting all the Commonwealth together, we probably have the most in common to talk about. TfL, Transport for London, is a respected regulator, so for sure a few Australians, and they were actually asked for comments in the weeks afterwards. Our relationships are different with every regulator everywhere. Feel quite good about where we got to in Australia. In London in particular, we had a license was up for renewal after 5 years, and they said we're not going to renew it, but you have the right to appeal, and you can keep operating in the meantime. So Uber continues to operate in London, but the regulator, they just weren't happy with a few of the things we were doing, and they brought attention to that issue, and so now we're talking. We want regulation. Regulation is better for the business, but we as a company are growing up and realising we are now regulated, and that just means different things for how we operate, the people we have in the building, and where our energy goes, and so we got to respect them, and you can keep taking rides along the door.
Yeah, as a global business, there's no question that when things happen on the other side of the world, they may have an impact here. And of course, the way the media cycle works, it's interesting when you wake up in the morning and whoa, what's just happened overseas. Now we're fortunate that those instances on Airbnb are certainly few and far between. In fact, if Airbnb was a city, it would be the safest city in the world relative to the number of incidents that do happen. But the thing is that we would say that one incident is one incident too many, and to work for a company where that is genuinely the ethos of the founders and the entire company is I think really incredible. And in fact, it was one of those moments a number of years ago where there was a home in California that was trashed, and this was very early on in Airbnb's sort of lifetime, and the founders and the employees literally said, like, it's over, like we're done. We didn't, someone's, the trust that's so important to our platform has been eroded, and it was in those moments that the teams that came together and said, okay, well, we need to introduce insurance, and so what does insurance look like? Is it $5,000? Is it $10,000? And for a moment they said, no, we want it to be $50,000. Well, out of that, the Airbnb host protection insurance is now is $1 million for every host, and we also have host liability insurance, which is the same as if you stayed anywhere else in the world. I think we're all familiar with innkeepers insurance. It's the same thing for a similar value. So I think it's out of those instances that take place and get the media's attention that can actually help you be better. And I think that that's something that it's been good to learn from those experiences.
Okay. Thank you.
David, Uber's been in the news over the last, 12 months or something for some of the reasons that no company wants to be in the news. How do you actually address the issues of, protecting your own perception of the internal ethos of the company when you've got, very adverse media going on? How do you manage that as a management team? I don't know how many you've got in Australia, but how do you manage that kind of storm and drama when it's happening?
Yeah, it is a moment when you realise everyone's looking at you as the local manager to see how do you react. Yeah, there was something that sparked a lot of news for us was one individual's experience of some sexual harassment in California. And I'll admit my first reaction was, oh well, that doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen in my team. But I quickly realised that that could be a mistake to have that assumption. So we came into it and said, look, this is an opportunity to just have another look. And it did give people some confidence to speak up and improve some of our local operations. It was difficult though, because it is, as tempting as it was to say like, oh, everything's fine here, that's just a problem over there, then you're not really being on one team and one company. So that was not the answer. It's been, the right things have happened. We were pretty focused on growing lots, and we got that done. We didn't spend a lot of time looking at ourselves, and so that has become abundantly clear, and so the company has been quite inward looking throughout this year, and there's a lot of excitement around that. And it's interesting, you talk to the HR team, and like, oh gosh, who do want to be on Uber's HR team? But like, people are joining because they know like it's the number one department right now, and we're looking around and figuring out what is the best way to do diversity and inclusion, what is the best way to do performance evaluation, what is the best way to do learning and development. And so it's an opportunity to have an impact. So it has been a bit inward looking. We obviously got ourselves a new CEO. We sort of marked the end of a chapter. He's on board. We've seen him up and running for a month or so, and there's a lot of excitement. So it's been a difficult year, but overdue. And so we're now, I joined the company, it was 100 people, now 16,000, and that is a very different company, but we just didn't really notice it happened.
Another question? Yep. Cool.
Thank you. This is probably more for you, David, but I guess it's been floating around the internet, one of the original pitch decks for Uber, and I think you alluded to the fact that back in the day, it was originally made for luxury driving service. And so I just thought that was really interesting where, that was the original pitch deck, and it was quite, I guess, vanilla, that pitch deck, and then how it's just turned into almost, it seems like everybody's using Uber. I guess, what were your thoughts on that, and how the company was able to pivot and, I guess, take on new technology as it came in to become more of a mainstream, car service?
Yeah, somewhere in that pitch deck, they had an estimated market size. I think it was like a few $1 billion. And of course, our revenue now exceeds that. So it was wrong. Every pitch deck is wrong, one way or another. Ours was wrong in the right ways. It was a luxury service. I mean, this ride-sharing thing, to be honest, wasn't even our idea. Others started doing it. It was Lyft in particular, and the history of it was more about students driving to school, to college every term, and sharing those long commutes. And then they said maybe this could work inside a city. And so we saw that, and it was difficult for the company because we had this identity around we're rich and fancy. And it's like these dark, heavy black fonts. And the idea of getting into a low-cost thing that was controversial. And likewise, candidly on the regulation side, we'd had our fair share of conversations with. One of the first cease and desist notices we received was back when the company was called Uber Cab, and they said, "Oh, you're advertising yourself as a cab service, but you don't have a cab license, so therefore cease." And that's the day the company became Uber instead of Uber Cab, and that was sort of that problem solved. So we'd had skirmishes on what we considered to be fairly trivial matters, and then a group like Lyft comes along and they're doing they're just taking rides in everyday cars, and we're like, oh gosh, this, based on our prior experience, we don't think the transport department's going to be okay with this. 6 months later, we were still operating. We're like, well, this looks like this is where the world's headed, so we got involved. So we've changed more than once ourselves in not a long period of time, which is important in the DNA to keep that alive. And then suddenly a team launches Uber Eats as well. So it's fun.
Kristen, we're going to just go microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm still sounding, trying to pick myself up off the floor at your comment about Australia's aggressive and fair regulation. In my entire time in government, I never heard anyone say that, so thank you. But I'm going to put my journalist hat on and ask you a question about same-sex marriage. we've had a lot of debate in Australia as we've gone through this postal survey about what types of religious freedom protections will come if same-sex marriage is legislated for by the Parliament. And you're often given the example of the baker refusing to bake a cake for a gay wedding, etc., etc. Now, it strikes me the people who provide accommodation are private citizens, and potentially a private citizen could say, as a gay couple, married couple rocked up to their home, I'm not going to allow you to stay here. And I don't know what the law would say about that, because they're private citizen. I don't know what your company would say about that. Have you thought about the potential for your business model, for the people who provide your product, because they're not your employees, to be able to practice discriminatory rules about who's able to access it? And have you had any experiences of this in the United States where this same issue has been debated?
I didn't know where you were going to go with that question, Phil.
Or I did.
And maybe we need a progressive former politician such as yourself making some decisions today, Christina. But as it relates to the Airbnb platform and discrimination, where it's very clear. Our terms of service, if you're a host on the platform, is that you cannot discriminate. And we've had instances sort of here in Australia where a host has done exactly that. The gay couple has turned up to their home, and it was being reported to us, and that host has been removed from the platform. So in a world, and I think there's been some more documented cases, whether it be based on race or religion or sexuality, where Airbnb has addressed it, and we're very clear on that. If you are a host on Airbnb, our terms of service say that you cannot discriminate against the sexuality of your guest, and that is clear. And if you're not going to welcome anyone from race, religion or sexuality into your home, then even though we say in a world where people can belong anywhere and we want people to have their own beliefs and so on, but you cannot host on Airbnb.
How does Uber transact that? A driver comes to a job, it's clearly, or in the driver's mind at least, they're picking up a gay couple. Don't get an Uber driver in Sydney, I'd say would be point number one there. But what's the policy with Uber with respect to that?
Yeah, no different, and for the benefit of both the riders and the drivers. We've actually seen one of the most common forms of discrimination, effectively in transport, has been around certain neighbourhoods where drivers would just refuse to service, particularly in the United States where tipping is common, and frankly in New York City in particular, African Americans just wouldn't get picked up. And so on the Uber platform, where you get a request, it doesn't say who they are or what their beliefs are or what they look like, they have found themselves to be far better serviced, so that's something we'd be happy and proud of. Because it's a request, it comes up on the screen, you know their rating, so drivers, if your score is too low, they are free to say no.
Right.
I declined to pick up a person with a 4.2 rating. That's we give them that freedom, certainly, but that's all the information I've got.
Don't they have the name?
Might get first name.
Come back to that, maybe over two. Another question from anybody? Oh, way over there, sorry, I know I tend to look right here, but yep.
Thank you. A question to you both, it's probably more applicable to you, David. I was just curious to know about the discussions you mentioned. You both had a seat at the table in discussing regulatory context with government. How has government been in Australia in terms of seeking out the sort of rich data that you have and seeing how they can use that for a whole vast range of purposes, transport, urban planning, whatever it may be?
Yeah, it's we actually built a solution to this because, one by one cities were coming to us saying, yeah, you got interesting data, like, can we have this or can we have that? We quickly realised that was going to be a nightmare to manage, so we recently built and launched a platform called Uber Movement. I highly recommend it. Log in, check it out yourself, which is focused specifically on travel times, getting around cities, and so it's a beautiful tool. You can plug in and you can see what happens on school holidays and what have you, whatever you want to do. But we just put it out there, it's free, open to the world, just to sort of manage, to avoid having to deal with a million one-off requests. The more pertinent data requests are around, we will cooperate with law enforcement when they're like, we have a reason to believe that this person was in this place at this time, do you have any data to confirm that for us? When it comes through in the appropriate form, we absolutely do, and cities appreciate that. And likewise around safety incidents. So if someone does bad things on our platform, the other platforms tend to want to know about that too. So the government can make sure that that information is shared.
From our perspective, there's a number of examples when we've worked collaboratively with government. We have an agreement, for example, with the Victorian State Government around emergency services, which particularly around bushfire season is something that we're able to alert all of our hosts and guests, guests in particular in terms of if they're travelling into a region that is struck by a bushfire or another natural disaster, we're able to message them and provide them with information, and alongside that we're able to alert our hosts, and we have a platform called our disaster relief platform that continues to be used all around the world, and we haven't had to necessarily, we've turned it on previously in Australia, where hosts are able to provide a home for the people that are impacted by a disaster to provide their home for free, and we see that certainly happening. That also really works well for emergency services workers that might have to go into a particular situation and there's somewhere for them to stay for free. So there are ways all around the world that we're working with government and looking to explore others.
Okay, time for one more. Who wants to? Right here. Wait for a mic, please, Claire. Yeah, thanks.
I just want to pick up on something that was talked about earlier, which was around Australians being good at picking up technology initially, as opposed to inventing technology. And I guess my question is, so you both have teams here in Australia. Are you seeing innovation within the teams being developed here being picked up internationally? You talked about the marketing side of things. What about from a technical development kind of side of things, research and development side of things? Question for both. Are we good at that?
Oh, that's a polite answer. No, fair enough.
I'm certainly happy to, it's a little bit of an easier, I think, question for me to answer as opposed to David, because we are largely just a marketing services organisation sort of here in Australia, and we don't hold ourselves out to be anything different to that. We want to be part of the popular culture conversation, but all the technology work that is sort of done on Airbnb is done offshore. And whilst we've become part of the Australian vernacular, it's unfortunately something that isn't set up here, and some of that is by design, but we do have input into the process, and we do have ways that we can sort of do that and contribute sort of to that, and there are certainly marketing initiatives or just global initiatives that we can be part of and influence, and we see them sort of take off elsewhere, but unfortunately we don't have an engineering sort of team here that we're able to build on our own.
My answer was yes, but I was trying to think of an example that's remotely sexy. It's highly operational, so a lot of the stuff has been around how do we get the government 10,000 applications electronically rather than doing it on paper. That's the sort of stuff that folks on my team have nailed and exported around the world. So the answer is yes. There's a good number of engineers in my team, myself included.
So there is, of that 200, how many are engineers?
Probably a quarter, I'd say.
Okay. Okay. And the reason for that is that the tweaking, making the app work in Sydney and Auckland and Melbourne and Brisbane is different to making that work in Tokyo or London or Paris.
Different alternatives in terms of transport, and most importantly, different regulatory environments.
Right, okay, right.
I might, if I may, bring this even back to the sharing economy and the collaboration that actually takes place. That's part of it, and I'm sure the same as this, it'll be the same for Uber. But if I use Airbnb as an example, so we have more than 100,000 hosts in Australia now, and that's grown from less than 10,000 3 or 4 years ago. Now, one of the opportunities that being a host on Airbnb provides is maybe a little bit of extra income, maybe the opportunity to pursue something that they really love, and be an inventor or an innovator themselves in what they do because of what being a host on Airbnb provides. We heard recently of a story where an Australian inventor has recently just gone to California and pitched an idea that he's had that is around conserving energy in a holiday home, and it was very well received, but that was something that he wouldn't be able to have done if he wasn't an Airbnb host. And so whether you're an artist or a baker, the things that you get to do because you've got a little extra income, that means you can do the things that you really want to do as opposed to the things that you have to do. And I think that that's a really key part of the innovation that the sharing economy broadly is providing to people.
Thanks for that, very interesting. So I'd like to call on the chairman of the board of the United States Study Centre, Mark Bailey, to move a vote of thanks and bring proceedings to a close.
Thanks, Simon. As Simon said, I'm Mark Bailey. I'm honoured to be the chair of the board of the US Study Centre. I won't take up much of your time, but I would like to thank you all very much for attending this evening's event. I'd also like to acknowledge Lucy Turnbull, Chief Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission, a current patron of the Centre and a former director of the Centre, and also Christina Keneally and Maria Appleton, who are both current board members of the United States Study Centre. I'd also like to thank Leah and Ashurst for providing this great venue. This event has turned out to be very popular, and this venue itself has been great to accommodate it in, so thank you. Lastly, I'd just like to extend a sincere vote of thanks to both Sam from Airbnb and David from Uber for such an insightful and thought-provoking discussion surrounding the rapid emergence of the sharing economy, which we only got to in the last part of it, but it's been a fascinating discussion. And the implications that we learn from the US experience as we look at this in Australia. It's funny, I was just reading about Airbnb. We talk about seed funding in venture capital, and its seed funding was actually the sale of cereal, I understand, in 2008, where they produced Obama Rose and Captain McCain's, which they raised $30,000 from, and that was literally their seed funding from cereal. So it was interesting the way to see some of these things start. These companies are only around a decade old, and yet in that space of time have grown to be global companies, and they're brands that now form part of our everyday vernacular. I think that's the fantastic thing that they've achieved. As Simon said at the start, we're very pleased to be able to convene what has been the second CEO to CEO event. This followed on from our first inaugural event with Mike Kane at Boral earlier this year. And I think tonight's event highlights that the Study Centre has abilities to engage key speakers on topics of relevance and importance to participate and influence discussion in the Australian-US alliance in all its different facets at such a critical stage in our relationship. Together with our recently released Indispensable Economic Partners report, which detailed the investment flows between our two countries, it's tangible evidence of the Centre's increased research focus on trade and economic relationship between our two countries, which has been fundamental to our continued economic growth. This now sits alongside what has been our traditional areas of focus in the security, foreign policy and political spheres, and these were demonstrated by recent events we convened, such as John McCain's speech in May here in Sydney, and also the Howard on Trump event in July. You will see more of us in this economic and business space, as well as our more familiar activities. I don't believe it's a contentious view that our trade agreements, supporting our close economic ties, and our security treaties with the United States significantly underwrite Australia's prosperity and peace. The Centre will continue to primarily focus on these aspects of our relationship, thereby acting in our country's national interest. For those of you who would like to learn more of our activities, research and upcoming events, please visit our website, www.ussc.edu.au, to sign up for events and to subscribe to our publications like our weekly newsletter called The 45th, which focuses on America through an Australian lens. Upcoming events which you may be interested in include next Tuesday evening, which is a good follow-on from how to go from startup to Silicon Valley, and it will be a conversation with Spencer Morn, an Australian who's now a partner in a Silicon Valley venture capital fund focused on the ag tech sector. And that will be a conversation with Claire McDonagh, our Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So again, thank you for coming, and I wish you all a safe journey home.